Hi everyone, thank you for your patience today. And welcome to Shifting Perspectives, the State of the World in 2024 with our special guest, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. My name is Sarah White and I'm the Head of Strategic Communications for the Australia-India Institute, and today I'll be your MC. I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which we're here today, and pay our respects to the elders, both past, present and emerging. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge those in the room. Honourable Tim Watts MP, Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs, thank you for being here. Mr Jacob Varghese, CEO of Maurice Blackburn, who's our corporate partner today. The Deputy Lord Mayor, Rashina Campbell, and Mr Rob Holland, Victoria Department of Premier and Cabinet for the government. The AII is really excited to be partnering with Maurice Blackburn today to deliver this insightful conversation with one of India's most influential freethinkers, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. To get our conversation underway, I would first like to invite the Honourable Tim Watts MP, Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs, to deliver his opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and let me also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, pay my respects to elders past and present, extend those respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with us here today. Let me also acknowledge distinguished guests who have come here to see quite an exciting thinker. There are some jobs that you get in politics that, maybe you're not springing out of bed to do, but when you see Dr. Shashi Tharoor on your schedule, it's an exciting day indeed. I have to say, so it's a pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Shashi Tharoor here at Melbourne University at the AII. I have to say, though, that just reading his CV is a bit intimidating. A doctorate in international relations from the Fletcher School at just 22 years of age. A successful international diplomat for 29 years, culminating as Under-Secretary of the United Nations. He's a noted orator, having famously given a speech on the impact of the British Empire on India at the Oxford Union that has attracted 10 million views on YouTube, been praised by all sides of politics in India, and ultimately became the best-selling book, Inglorious Empire, an extraordinary piece of polemic and a common gift of myself to other MPs wanting to learn more about India. He's an author as prodigious as he is perspicacious, having published, what is the figure? I've got 23 books in English, 26, I'm sure that wasn't right, which makes him possibly the only Member of Parliament in the Westminster orbit to have published more books than my colleague, Dr. Andrew Leigh. He's the former chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs and on Information Technology, the four-term Member of Parliament for the constituency of Thiruvananthapuram in the Lok Sabha, a constituency perfectly suited to Dr. Tharoor because any constituency of less than 7 syllables would have been a waste of his linguistic skills. I'm pleased that you applaud that line because that's a joke that I stole from Dr. Tharoor's stand-up comedy set that you can still watch on Amazon Prime. And yes, I have watched it, and insufferably, yes, he's even good at that. Now, one of Dr. Tharoor's many books is an outstanding biography of Nehru. Now, regrettably, Nehru never visited Australia himself. Today, of course, Australian Prime Ministers and Indian Prime Ministers are regular visitors to our respective countries. For much of Nehru's time as Prime Minister, racist Australian immigration policies hindered the relationship between our two countries. But today, the Indian-Australian community is 1 million strong, the community in Melbourne alone is 4 lakh strong, and the diaspora is one of the great strengths of our relationship. Now, reflecting on his expectations of the Australia-India relationship at the time, Nehru noted to a colleague that it was pointless to send an intellectual to Australia as High Commissioner. Today, though, a steady stream of thinkers travel between our countries, including just last week one of Dr. Tharoor's co-authors, the indefatigable Samir Saran at Rosina Down Under in Canberra. And of course, today we have a packed house of intellectuals, of thinkers at Melbourne University here to hear one of India's best-known public intellectuals talk with us here today. So in this spirit, before I hand over the stage to the main act, let me finish by sharing something that I've learned from him. I've read and enjoyed a number of Dr. Tharoor's books, and you'll learn something new on every page. Indeed, sometimes it feels like you learn a new word on every page. But the word that I've learned from Dr. Tharoor wasn't from one of his books, it was from one of his tweets. I think you know where this is going. At the conclusion of the previous Indian Test cricket tour to Australia and following their history-making series win, Dr. Tharoor delved deep into his vocabulary to teach Australians a new word. Can you remember what it was? Epicaricity. Epicaricity? It's an obscure word in the definition of the dictionary. The definition of which is rejoicing or deriving pleasure from the misfortunes of others. Now, it's a rare word, but it's one that I did find some use for recently during India's recent Test series with New Zealand. And it's one that I hope to make use of again in this summer of cricket, as the contest for the Border Gavaskar Trophy begins once again on our shores here in Australia. So thank you to Dr. Tharoor. Thank you for your contribution to public life, for your many books, and for your friendship of Australia. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your conversation today.
Thank you, Assistant Minister Watts, for your opening remarks. We're so pleased to continually have the support of the Australian Government for the India-Australia relations, and the Institute is really grateful for that support. So I'd now like to invite the panel and read out bios. I feel like Tim has already read out a very impressive bio, but let's repeat it because you're our guest of honour. I'm going to start with Lisa. Lisa Singh really needs no introduction and would be familiar to many of you. For the past 3 years, she's been CEO of the Australia-India Institute, Australia's leading think tank on enhancing Australia-India relations. As many of you would know, Lisa is a former Australian senator and was the first woman of South Asian heritage to be elected to the Australian Parliament. She's also the former Tasmanian Member of Parliament and Minister of the Tasmanian Government. Representing Australia as an influential professional, Lisa has been advancing Australia's social and economic ties with the Indo-Pacific region for over a decade. In 2014, she was awarded the Pravasi Bharati Samman by the President of India for building friendly Australia relations, and just last week was recently awarded with an International Alumni Award by the University of Tasmania. Very exciting. Now for our guest of honour. An author, politician and former international diplomat, Dr. Shashi Tharoor puts anyone to shame. He straddles several worlds of experience. He's currently in his 4th term as the Indian Member of Parliament. He has 29 years of experience as a senior UN diplomat and the current chair of India's Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. Dr. Tharoor has just celebrated writing 26 books. I'd like to know where you find the time for that. And is renowned for his eloquence and mastery of the English language. He has also won multiple awards, including the Pravasi Bharati Samman, something that you both have in common. So thank you, Dr. Tharoor, for joining us here today. We cannot wait for this insightful discussion. And at that point, I'd like to welcome both of you to the stage.
Well, thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
It's delightful to be here, and thank you for that warm introduction. And also a very big thank you to the Honourable Tim Watts, Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs. I'm going to have that problem today. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to this In Conversation with Dr. Shashi Tharoor here at the University of Melbourne. I have to say I am very excited to be hosting Dr. Shashi Tharoor here in Australia, and I concur with the comments of Assistant Minister Tim Watts, and I would like to add that despite enjoying interactions with Dr. Tharoor in India on numerous occasions, that having him here in Australia again is just wonderful for us, but also for the Australia-India Institute that I lead. And I would like to, at the outset, also thank Maurice Blackburn, lawyers, particularly CEO Jacob Varghese, for helping make today possible. So, Dr. Tharoor, welcome back to Australia.
Delighted to be back.
Or should I say the land down under. We've certainly turned on the weather for you here in Melbourne today. And I guess, weather aside, I just wanted to ask you, how are you finding it? Is it like you imagined from the last time you visited Australia? Do you have any distinct memories from that time that differ from now?
Oh, well, I've had half a dozen visits, I think, in the last 30 years. My very first was when I won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize and came to Sydney to collect it back in '91. And then I've been back to the Adelaide Writers' Festival, the Melbourne Writers' Festival, then got too busy to be taken seriously as a writer anymore in my other life, so I haven't come back to, I haven't been invited to any of those thereafter, but I have come back officially. Had a good visit, official visit, when I was at the UN in 2003, and had lots of meetings at DFAT. I saw the War Memorial for the first time in Canberra, and I went back to India and talked about how important it was for us to have one too. We finally do, but I was very struck by the one here. I've since then had somewhat briefer visits. One tends to get busy, and so this particular trip, I've had 2 days in Canberra, less than 24 hours in Melbourne. I'm leaving this evening. But nonetheless, Australians are wonderful people. It's a delight to meet you all and to exchange thoughts with you. I was addressing and keynoting the Australian Institute of International Affairs annual conference. And it was fascinating, for example, to hear the Australian take on the Trump victory and things like that, which was a lot of fun. But also Australia's increasing sense of connectedness to the rest of Asia has been fascinating to watch evolve. You have become, I think, very much, of course, the world is getting far closer to each other as well, but I think you've become far more conscious of your I think you see yourselves not so much as almost a distinct or isolated continent apart, but as very much a part of the Asian continent and of the Indo-Pacific in particular, and that I think is something that brings us together as Indians and Australians too. And the fact that you have 1 million Indians in this country helps, doesn't it? I mean, it does mean that none of you, and I think, Tim, you won't mind my revealing when I talked about his interest in India. He said, well, 1 out of every 3 voters I've got is an Indian. So of course I've got to be interested in India. And that's also going to be increasingly common amongst political leaders in this country. So a lot more reason to celebrate the connection and to want to keep coming back.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that, and you will always be welcome back. But I want to ask you a little bit about your home in India. Now, you are from the state of Kerala. Yep. Which is, of course, in the south of India, and it's where your constituency is based, in your parliamentary seat of Trivandrum. I wanted to ask you, and sort of take you back, I guess, as to what was it that made you want to run for politics? And also, who have been some of the key influences of your worldview, particularly as a young man? Oh, gosh, well, those are vast questions. Influences as a young man, I mean, I think for most of us, my father was a very profound influence. He was a largely self-made man and somebody whose views, whose ideas, whose passions infected me in many, many ways. He was also a fairly directive father, so he got me out of my instinctive introversion, made me into a speaker and a debater and an actor, and just said, you have to do this. And I think in many ways, pretty much everything that I have become and am have been shaped more by him than by anyone else. Nehru died when I was 8 years old, so I can't say that I had much opportunity to be directly inspired by him, but later in life, reading, I've imbibed a lot of his vision of India and what India was all about, and the entire Indian experiment. And though in my teenage years it was fashionable to decry the so-called Nehruvians as sort of old fossils, I think today I'd probably be proud to consider myself as one. With the capacity to be critical, which I am, and I've written a biography of him, which is no hagiography, but which I really do have an enormous amount of respect for his mind, his vision, his principles. And then in international affairs, was read and inspired by somebody who died the year I was born, practically, no, 5 years after I was born, Hammarskjöld, but in many ways had the opportunity to work very closely with
the only other Secretary General fit to be mentioned in the same breath, and that's Kofi Annan, who really was an inspiring leader and a wonderful human being. And so if you had to give you a list of influences, those would be the three. Why did I run for office? Well, as you probably know, I ran for Secretary General and lost, as Groucho Marx would say, close but no cigar. 2 votes short of Ban Ki-moon, but one of those 2 votes was an American veto. So that was that. And to suddenly find yourself unemployed at not yet 51 was a sobering moment. I had to decide what to do with myself. I was too young to retire, and I'd done nothing else since I was 22 when I joined the UN. So I sort of spent a year and a bit just making money, which has never been a motivation up to that point and left me quite cold. I was getting, in those days, $50,000 US a pop for a speech, and I made a few. And I was also consulting with a Dubai-based company that was interested in India, so that gave me an opportunity to travel to India a fair amount almost every month. And that's when I began to sort of renew some of my friendships in India, including my contacts with the political establishment. And then, to my very pleasant surprise, I was invited to contest the elections of 2009. And out of sheer ignorance and naivety and folly, I said yes. Now, I say all of that because I left India at 19 to go to graduate school in the US at a time when the voting age was 21. So I'd never even seen an election up close, never voted in one. I had no idea what I was getting into. And it turned out to be much harder than walking minefields in Bosnia, as I'd also done. It really turned out to be one of the more instructive, dumber decisions I'd made. But I did enjoy, in the end, 4 victories, and now I'm in the beginning of a 4th term in Parliament, which in the lower house is always more challenging, but in the lower house coming from Kerala is particularly so, because the Keralite voter is rightly very demanding. We are the most literate state in the India and have been for a very long time, also therefore the most conscious of our rights. Not so much of our duties, but that's another conversation. Unlike some of our more sort of relaxed parliamentarians in the north, we are constantly kept on our toes by our electorate. So it's been a pretty demanding, fulfilling 15 years. And I will probably see out this term, but almost certainly not contest a 5th election. I just think it's time to make way for younger people to do it. And if the party still wants me around, they can pop me into the upper house, I'd like to think. But I don't know if they will. I'm just saying that may be another way to stay involved in the national conversation.
Well, you've still got quite a bit of time left of your current term, having only just got re-elected.
That's right.
It's fascinating to hear about some of your influences. I always enjoy going to the Indira Gandhi Museum in Delhi and actually reading some of those letters between her father, Nehru, to her during that time.
He was very conscious that as a frequent jailee, I mean, he'd been jailed 11 years of his adult life, that he needed to be more, he was a very absent father, and he needed to be more present in her life. And the letters were a way of guiding her in the kinds of things a father might otherwise have told a daughter in conversation. So it turned out to be essentially a statement of his vision of the world for her.
Yes, exactly. And we all get to benefit by now being able to go and visit her
thank the British for
Maurice.
jailing him and forcing him to write letters instead of talking to his daughter.
Thanking them for something.
These days, none of us write enough letters, right? We're constantly on the phone to each other. So much more wisdom is lost to posterity from our time than was in the earlier days, and people actually put their thoughts down much more.
You touched on a little bit about your state of Kerala, and it brings me to India as a country. It is so incredibly diverse, and there is a real sort of difference in terms of the different states throughout India. I wanted to ask you that in terms of the south of India versus the north of India, and how you see that in terms of its distinct differences. What is so distinct or different about the south of India?
Well, I mean, the simple answer is, of course, the south is much more literate, and it's much higher up the human development chain. Human development measures things like literacy, empowerment of women, healthcare, the various kinds of things that enhance the quality of life in people. it's not a measure of GDP, where Kerala lags behind many other states, but certainly in terms of human development, since about the mid-90s, Kerala has the only valid comparator would be the United States in all the human development indicators, except Kerala has more newspapers surviving per head of population than the Americans do, but otherwise it's got all the human development indicators of a developed country. What it doesn't have, of course, is the GDP. When I pointed this out in a book called India from Midnight to the Millennium way back in 1997, about the time of the 50th anniversary of India's independence, I think the US GDP was about 22 times that of Kerala's. It's probably greater, the gap now. But the fact still is that that is one of the most striking distinctions. The literacy rate, of course, the rest of India has been catching up significantly. Now, Kerala hit 92, 93% in the early 90s and is technically 100% literate. I say technically because you can quibble about what literacy is and so on, and we can get into that conversation if the audience is interested later. But just to say that, at that point, India was not yet 70% literate. Today, India is well into the mid-80s, and we don't really have a totally up-to-date figure because we haven't had a census since 2011. But thanks to COVID and thanks to politics. But anyway, the fact is that in Kerala, there is no difference whatsoever between female literacy and male literacy, whereas in India to this day, while men are about 90%, women are still in the 70s, and that's why the average is about 82, 83%. So that's the kind of other distinction worth pointing out. The other problem is not so much South and North generally, but specific states and other states. Because each state has had its own distinctive historical experiences. And one of the big fault lines that has emerged in Indian politics today has been about attitudes to history. The ruling party in Delhi, which also rules in a large number of states across the north, has a sort of chip on the shoulder about the Muslim invasions and so on. But we had no Muslim invasions. For us in Kerala, Islam came very peacefully. We'd had Arabs trading with Kerala for 1,000 years before the birth of the Prophet. And they would come with the seasonal winds and spend months in Kerala and then sail back. And that's why the Arab population is so completely intermingled with the people of Kerala. And then sometime in the 7th century, this news came with these traders who were coming. You know what's happening in our peninsula? There's this prophet going around saying these things. I mean, literally, that's... And so one of our Kerala rulers, Chairman Perumal, heard this news and said, hey, I want to meet this prophet. Sounds very interesting. And he got on a ship, and there were a flotilla of boats that accompanied him, and he sailed off to the peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula, to meet the prophet. He never made it back, but to this day, the evidence of his voyage can be seen south of Salalah in Oman. There are Kerala coconut trees growing there, which are not native to the Arabian Peninsula, but which were taken by Chairman Perumal's party back in the lifetime of the prophet. So these are the kinds of historical differences. Kerala is just about 53% Hindu. India as an overall nation is over about 80%. And so the people of Kerala, whether they're Christian or Muslim or Hindu or anything else, and we have the oldest Jewish diaspora outside Palestine, though the numbers have dwindled considerably in the last few decades, but for 2,000 years, starting with the destruction of the first Jewish temple by the Babylonians, and certainly after the destruction of the second by the Romans, we've had Jews in Kerala. Then when doubting Thomas, the apostle, St. Thomas, landed on the shores of Kerala, he was greeted on shore by a flute-playing Jewish girl. And so all of these histories have meant that nobody in Kerala has a minority complex. There's no sense of being different from anybody else. You happen to sport a Christian name or a Muslim name or a Hindu name, doesn't matter. You're still one of us, and you have as many rights, entitlements, angularities as anyone else. So these are very striking things about Kerala, largely true of Tamil Nadu as well, less true of Karnataka, where there was a more challenging history, where there were more wars and fights in some of them. But again, till the British came, there was no real consciousness of it being Muslim versus Hindu. There were kings and princes, and they fought each other. And some of them happened to be Muslims fighting Muslims, and some of them happened to be Hindus fighting Hindus, and sometimes a mixture of both. One of the sultans of what's today Telangana would be a chap who actually gave himself an Arabic or Persian title, a Muslim title as well. He was a Hindu king. And you've got various examples like this. There was a lot more interpenetration and so on. So you've got these different histories across India. Northern India has had, as a result, a somewhat different politics from the south in recent years.
So let's talk about that politics, because India's just had an election this year. It's been quite a year in the world for democracy, with a number of elections, and we'll get to the US election shortly.
You've left out Botswana. They had an election and turfed out the ruling party after 50 years.
That's true, and South Africa as well. There's been quite a few, but I wanted to ask you about the Indian election. Obviously, there was a lot of differences across states in India in terms of the Indian election this year. I wanted to ask you, did you anticipate the sort of result that we saw in India? How do you see what really happened in India at the last election?
Well, at one level, there was a sort of mathematical process. You know, the BJP had first come to power in 2014 with 31% of the vote. But thanks to the first-past-the-post system, they had a very convincing majority. They improved their majority with 37% of the vote in 2019. And this time, they crossed the 300 mark. We have 543 seats in Parliament, 272 is the majority. They got 303 last time. And this time, Mr. Modi was confidently talking about crossing 400. The main difference, of course, was that the majority vote was fragmented amongst multiple parties. And so this time, a much more serious effort was made by a collection of 20-odd parties, which called itself the India Alliance, inclusive, nationalistic, developmental, and so on. Indian National Developmental and Inclusive Alliance. And they, in many states, did not divide the vote amongst themselves. They put forward one person. It still wasn't true of all 543 seats, but I think in almost 400 seats, there was one strong opposition candidate against the BJP candidate. There were many places where that didn't work out, and there were many places where the BJP wasn't the strongest, because again, that's the magic of a country as large and diverse as ours. And so they fought each other. And many of these smaller parties are regional parties, which are only strong in one state. So in the past, for example, the Congress, being a national party, would fight everywhere, and the regional party might end up getting as many votes as the Congress, in some cases more, and so neither of them would win and the BJP would get through. That kind of thing got reduced. So that's one partial explanation for what happened. What happened was the BJP went from 303, not to 400, but down to 240. They lost their majority. And they had to form a government with half a dozen other smaller parties, all regional ones. So there's a party with 17 seats, a party with 15 seats, a party with 11 seats, a couple of parties with 5 seats. And that's how the BJP now has a coalition of 295 in Parliament, but that 55 comes from 5 or 6 other parties. Now, in many ways, it was a BJP victory that looked like a defeat, and partially because of their own level of expectations. And it was a defeat for the opposition that looked like a victory, because we all did better than we had done in the 2 previous elections. Congress had been decimated in 2014 to 44 seats. We were down to 52 in 2019, but after a death and a by-election, we were down to 50. And now we have 101. So suddenly, we've doubled our presence in the Lok Sabha. Many of the there's a party called the Samajwadi Party in Uttar Pradesh, which is the Socialist Party there, which was our ally in this election. Samajwadi has ended up at 27 seats in UP, which is a substantial number. So you're seeing significant changes like that. The Trinamool, the Samajwadi, the DMK of Tamil Nadu are regional parties which all have now a decent cohort in the Lok Sabha. We have 100. So suddenly the opposition has a much stronger voice in the Lok Sabha than it has had for the preceding 10 years. On the other hand, and this is where it gets sort of tougher, the government, after having initially shaken by this, and even looking a bit adrift and a bit lost, has rapidly regrouped. And they've realized that they are actually as secure for 5 years as if they'd had a majority. partially because no one of the coalition allies is in a position to blackmail them or threaten to bring the government down, because no one of them has enough seats to make the difference between the majority and the minority. So as long as you keep individual parties happy, you're secure. And the BJP has come right back, as we saw in the last session of Parliament, with a fair amount of self-confidence about its agenda and its plans and the issues it wants to initiate. As far as the overall electoral map is concerned, the other thing about India is every 6 months, somewhere or the other, there's an election. Because again, the parliamentary system, when we started off back in 1952, the states and the centre, the union government, all were elected at the same time. That went on 57, 62, 67. Well, in 67, a lot of minority governments were elected in the states. Some governments didn't have enough seats. Then subsequently, the central government, the union government, Indira Gandhi, split. And they also called an early election. So suddenly, elections started taking place whenever governments fell, or whenever someone lost a vote of confidence, or whenever a coalition partner deserted. And suddenly you had a completely mixed up election schedule, because whenever a government fell under the constitution, you have to have a new state election within 6 months. And so what essentially ended up happening is that we now have a situation where literally every 6 months, usually roughly every spring and every winter, there will be an election somewhere, sometimes 2 or 3 or 4. And so it becomes a process of a kind of rolling referendum on the government of the day. Not just the state government, especially under the BJP, the national leaders have made it a point to go and campaign in state elections all the time. So Mr. Modi made every state election a bit of a referendum on himself, and then that became a new litmus test for the opposition as well. Well, within a few months of the general election this year, we had state elections. It should have been state elections in 4 states, but the Election Commission kind of obliged the government and had 2 ending in September, results early October, and 2 more scheduled for late November. So the result suddenly was that the government could focus on 2 states at a time rather than being dispersed over 4. There was a shock result in the state of Haryana, which all the polls for the last 2 years had said was going to vote the Congress in, and we managed to lose to the BJP, which is again psychologically a major setback from the general election results. Now we have 2 more states coming up. The results will be known on the 23rd of this month, and one of them is the second biggest state in the union, that's Maharashtra, where Mumbai is the capital, Bombay. And there, again, we were very much ahead, but now it looks like a much closer fight. So we'll have to see what happens. So if the BJP is able to claw back these victories in states, then it's regained some of the credibility it lost in the center. And conversely for us, if we were able to accentuate that momentum from the general election by winning more states, we would have had the momentum with us. But at the moment, Haryana has been a setback, and now Maharashtra is extremely important for our own credibility.
Well, I always enjoy that. I think every time I go to India, there is some sort of election going on somewhere in some state. There's never a dull moment in the world's biggest democracy. I want to take you, though, to something that's just happened, which has, in a sense, perhaps shocked the world. And that, of course, is the United States election. In terms of what has just occurred, do you think that Trump's presidency will be more of the same for India-US relations and foreign policy? I mean, he does have, as president, a certain view of America's interests. How do you see it, Dr. Tharoor?
Well, look, Lisa, on the one hand, I think everyone understands that the one word everyone can apply to President Trump is the word unpredictable. So sitting around predicting what he will do may be challenged. I think some American commentator once said, I don't think the president knows what he's going to do. He can barely predict his own decisions. So that's the first thing, is we can't really be sure what will come out of him in policy. But on the other hand, you've seen him in action for 4 years. So there shouldn't be too many surprises. You've broadly got a sense of what his instincts are and how he conducts himself. And I think it's fairly clear that his campaign also made very clear what his priorities are going to be. And probably this is why he won the votes he did. I mean, don't forget, for the first time, unlike the last victory, he actually won a majority of the popular vote. And so people want him to deal with illegal immigration. People want him to lower their taxes. People want him to to bring inflation down. I'm not sure the two of them were compatible, by the way. If he lowers taxes and raises tariffs, then he might end up creating more inflation, but that's another matter. Still, I mean, if those are the messages he takes, he's going to act like that, is what I would expect. But he's still unpredictable, and so we should certainly brace ourselves, at least for the occasional statements that might give us a bit of a frisson. But at the same time, I think on core issues, he wants allies to pay their way. So I think you've got a fairly stiff bill coming for your nuclear submarine. You would have done cheaper if you'd come to India, but that's another matter. We make nuclear subs too. At least we made one so far, and we're making a second one now. We do it indigenous technology. We will, I think, expect to see a fairly tough attitude towards China. That seems to be part of his and his ecosystem's vision of the world. I imagine that if he's going to stick to what he said publicly, that he will want to move the Ukrainians towards peace. And equally, if he sticks to what he says publicly, he's going to give Mr. Netanyahu a very free hand in Gaza. Those seem to be at least four things that become apparent from what he's done before and what he said he will do again.
Well, what about in terms of multilateralism? I mean, you have had an incredibly long, illustrious career at the United Nations at a very senior diplomatic level. But in light of Trump's history of, when he was last president, of pulling out of various multilateral agreements, such as the Paris Agreement on climate change and the like, do you think multilateralism and groupings, smaller groupings perhaps like the Quad, for example, or indeed just the United Nations itself, is under threat under a Trump presidency?
I think there are going to be challenges. He also pulled out of UNESCO and announced the pullout of WHO, but that takes a year to come into effect. And he'd lost the election, so Biden cancelled the pullout of WHO. But otherwise, the US was pulling out of both UNESCO and WHO, and that's not been a good sign. But you know what's interesting, and often people don't realize, is that the UN is both a stage and an actor. It is a stage in which the member states play their parts. It is an actor when the member states agree and entrust the Secretary General or the agencies or a peacekeeping operation with the mandate, the resources, and the support to do certain things. And the UN's done those very well, which is why we've got a slew of Nobel Peace Prizes for the UN agencies and the UN itself and UN peacekeepers and so on to point to. I think that Trump still finds the UN as stage useful. It's a place where he can go and declaim, can lay out America's agenda on the world. He can even use it to chide other nations. He's done that before. But UN as actor, I think, is in trouble. I don't think that the US under Trump is going to be wanting to use multilateral instruments as much as we've always been doing till now. And I think, therefore, don't expect an empowered Secretary General, don't expect too many cutting-edge peacekeeping operations, don't expect the agencies to be given a free hand to solve problems, don't expect WHO to be supported to handle the next pandemic, and so on and so forth. That's going to be tougher for the next 4 years. So the UN as stage, fine. The UN as actor, I think, in peril.
And so how does that play out, Dr. Tharoor? I mean, if it is the UN in peril, you know, this is the body where we're supposed to come to the peace table to resolve conflict. How do you see the future of certain conflicts playing out if it's not done through that collective?
It will depend on the conflict. I mean, frankly, if the Trump administration cares about a conflict, the UN will not get a sniff of it. If it's something that's far removed from their concerns, they won't mind if the UN goes around doing the peace. It's as simple as that. I mean, that's actually been a strain in US foreign policy even before Trump. It's been a while since the UN as UN was seriously involved, for example, in Middle Eastern peace. Every major initiative since Oslo was done outside the UN framework. And the recent Abraham Accords and so on, they're in the last Trump administration. If that's the forerunner of what's going to happen, they'll keep the UN out of it. It'll be a minilateral arrangement, not a multilateral arrangement. There'll be a few countries that they will connect to do this. Conversely, if there's a crisis somewhere in Africa or the South Pacific or Central Asia or whatever, the UN will probably say, US will probably say, go ahead and leave it to the UN or somebody else to solve.
But that, in a sense, has become a bit more of the norm, as you say anyway, of late, in terms of minilateral groupings. So the Quad, for example, which is something quite important for Australia, and particularly the Quad 2.0, which has been elevated under Biden to the leadership summit level. How do you see the future of the Quad under a Trump presidency?
Oh, I think it was Trump, in fact, who announced the elevation to the summit level. It took place under Biden, but I think Trump liked the idea of the Quad. I don't think he had any problem with it. But I think, again, he's a very transactional individual and politician, so he's going to be fairly exacting, and if he feels that other members are not transacting on the terms that he wants, he can always move on. I mean, that's something, I think we've got to be prepared for that. I think if, for example, India's a good example, as an Indian, I accept that my government has rather adeptly played all sides of every issue. I mean, we've increased our Russian oil and gas imports from 2% of our energy mix to 40%, even while staying on the right side of America on this matter. We have been able to keep very close relations with Israel while affirming publicly our commitment to a state for the Palestinians. And so we try, frankly, to manage both. Now, I think that maybe get more difficult under Mr. Trump on some issues. He may just say, I mean, I certainly am more critical of China than my government feels it can be. I mean, China is sitting on our border, they're nibbling away at our frontier. We had a very peaceful arrangement with them from 1976, where not a shot was fired in anger, no lives were lost. And suddenly the Chinese come and belligerently upend all these agreements, take over territory that both sides used to patrol in, and kill 20 of our soldiers. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not prepared to take that lightly. And then there's no question of being non-aligned in a global confrontation with the Americans, because if China is doing this to me and the Americans are going to give them a tough time, I should much rather cheer on the Americans and see how I can be helpful to them. I mean, that's my view. It's a personal view. It's not either a party position or a governmental position, but I think it's something that one has to have a view on. So it'll all will depend on what Mr. Trump sees as necessary in a particular moment. And when we talk, we should also not forget there are 4 years ahead of us, and issues may arise or crises may arise over those 4 years, which we certainly can't predict now, and on which we can't predict how he will react. So I think it's going to be, fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be an interesting ride.
Well, I'm going to bring you back now to this beautiful old Quad building that we find ourselves in here at the University of Melbourne, because we are joined with a range of scholars who are keenly interested in your views on the Australia-India relationship. I want to really ask you, why do you think it has taken so long for our two nations to get here? And, to be close and comfortable with one another. How do you see the future of this relationship? And does Australia matter to India?
Increasingly, yeah. I mean, I'd say to begin with, there wasn't much, and I think Tim Watts also alluded to that. I mean, our first High Commissioner here was a cricketer, because I think we assumed that's all that Australia knew about India, was that we played cricket. Indeed, in our first year of independence, we had a cricket tour of Australia, but didn't have another one for 20 years. And it didn't help, of course, that you had a white Australia policy. And the overt racism that was, therefore, governmental policy in this country was not exactly conducive to warming relations. So other than meeting in the Commonwealth, I don't think really had very much going between the two countries. That changed from the late 60s, and a number of things have happened. Number one, we've begun to discover each other much more. And number two, the Indian professional migration to Australia has resulted in the creation of and the growth of a remarkable diasporic community that's now 1 million strong. The Consul General was telling me he's got 54,000 Indian students in Melbourne. I could barely believe it. I think, if I'm not mistaken, certainly when I was in the States, it was about 100,000 in the entire United States, and 54,000 one Australian city. So there's a transformation here. The other thing that is definitely relevant is that Australia, I think, has become much more conscious of itself as a part of Asia. Not just Asia. I mean, I think there was a sense in the past, right up to the late 60s, that Australia was a continent unto itself. It was isolated from the rest of the world. It could look after its own affairs. And of course, if there were any affiliations, it was to the Anglosphere and particularly to Britain. That clearly seems to have changed significantly, Gough Whitlam onwards, Bob Hawke and others who articulated a different vision of what Australia's place in the world was. And now that Australia is such an important voice in the Indo-Pacific, India fits right in. So that's important for us too. And finally, I think the size of your diaspora is bound to contribute significantly, because already we're seeing in the States how, in a much smaller percentage, because it's, I think, 4 million out of 300 million there, and it's 1 million out of 7 million here. So the percentage is higher in Australia. But you've already seen in the States that American politicians don't feel they can afford to ignore Indians. Indians are not only voters, but they're also active in fundraising. I remember going as far back as the 88 or 92 election of George W. Bush when he lost to Clinton the second time. His largest fundraiser was an Indian dentist in Florida called Dr. Zachariah. So fundraising is something Indians are good at. They're the most affluent minority in America anyway. The most affluent ethnic group. They actually have a larger per capita income than white Americans. You've got the willingness to be active. Indians will go out and campaign. Indians will go out and organize. Indians will go out and knock on doors. You've got the abilities that make Indians very good staffers in the Senate and Congress in the US, and I imagine increasingly in Canberra you will find Indian staff who will be very useful to political leaders. And so far in America, less so in India, you'll also have Indians willing to run and win elective office. I think in Australia, at least as a relatively rare figure, there haven't been that many Indian-Australian elected officials, but I'm convinced their numbers will increase. They're bound to. It's happened in America, it's going to happen here too. So for all of these reasons, I think the diaspora will become itself part of the momentum in India-Australia relations. And for all of these reasons, I think we are on the upswing. The relationship is warm, it is warming, and it'll get warmer still. Well, unlike your weather in Melbourne.
Well, it makes it a great time to be heading up an institute that focuses on the Australia-India relationship, and to be able to have you here, Dr. Tharoor. But I can't hog all of your time today. I do want to ask our audience to ask you a question. So this is your chance. Who would like to ask Dr. Tharoor a question? Yes,
is there going to be a mic going around?
If you could just stand and say your name and your organisation. Thank you so much.
Is this a mic?
Yes.
Oh. Hello. First, I want to say, well, I'm Kishwa, and I guess I'm from MasterChef Australia. But it is such an honour and a pleasure to hear about your perspectives, not just on politics, but especially the cultural aspects of the area you're from. And I think in the work that I do, it's really about, as a chef, it's about a lot of us diasporas or people looking at India from the outside, is a lot of India's culture is painted with a very singular paintbrush. And I'm from East India, I'm Bengali, and I really strive to take Bengali cuisine globally and in fine dining spaces. I want to ask you, what is it specific to Kerala and cultural aspects of Kerala that you want to shed light on and take to the rest of the world, and that Australia should know and love and embrace?
I just did. She asked that question, and so I won't repeat myself, but I think there are distinctive qualities to each of our Indian states, and it'd be wonderful if Australians discover more and more of these things. I mean, you said Eastern India. Where from in Eastern India?
So, mum's from Calcutta, and my father is from Dhaka in Bangladesh, so very Bengali.
Right. Yeah, so there you are. I mean, that Bengali culture has so much to offer and so much one can instruct. Today I had a breakfast meeting with members of the diaspora. It was organised by another organisation working for the government of Australia, the Australia-India Council. And there's a woman there born in Australia whose own daughter is now in her late teens and is in university. But she was able to find a teacher, get this girl to learn Bharatnatyam, and her Arangetram is next week. And this is, a third generation Australian. There was a grandfather who migrated here in the first wave of migrants in 1969. So when I think about these kinds of experiences, Indians have this ability to keep in touch with a culture beyond that of the country they've come to. I don't think you have to think of yourself as a hyphenated Australian, though increasingly I found people do, and that's fine too in my view, because if Australia is accepting of this diversity, there shouldn't be any stigma attached to that hyphenation. But in any case, if you can also say, here's something, my daughter, I was born in Australia, my daughter's born in Australia, but she's going to be doing an Indian dance that's 2,000 years old. Come and watch it. Why not? I think it's, Australia in many ways could be enriched by these sorts of experiences. Yeah. And so I hope that we'll see much more of different parts of India. But certainly, if people, as a result, are more conscious of the differences, if they know that it's not unusual to come across a Kerala Christian who thinks of himself as Keralite first, perhaps, or proud of his Malayali culture, or dresses in the same way as his Hindu or Muslim friends, but has a totally different faith tradition.
Yeah, what do you think some of the doors are to open for
Kerala.
that? I think a lot of the time in my work, I find that people think of, when people looking at India and people outside the Indian diaspora thinking of India, they're thinking of Diwali, butter chicken and Bollywood. And it's this very North Indian-based culture, and they're not looking to the South as sort of cultural ambassadors. So what are some of those bridges, and what do you think makes Southern culture or, say, Eastern culture, how do we bring that to the rest of the world successfully?
If I had to name one term, it would be diversity. I think the main thing is to say that, yes, there are people in India for whom butter chicken is as unfamiliar as it is to you. But increasingly, though, India too has become more and more accepting of its diversity. It's now very easy to get masala doshas and idlis in Delhi, or chole bhature in Madras and Chennai. I mean, those things which used to be very much associated with one region of India have now spread. I used to joke, because I was married into Bengal for some time, that you can't find a decent Bengali restaurant in Calcutta. You've got to go to someone's home, because the idea of going to a restaurant to eat Bengali food didn't make sense to most Bengalis. Now you've got some very classy Bengali restaurants specializing in Bengali. You can home order Bengali food in Delhi. So there are all these transformations. I was asked to inaugurate a Bengali restaurant in Delhi just last month. So I can say that there's the celebration of diversity is what I could tell the Australians. Tell the Australians, don't think you've eaten Indian food. Think you've eaten Mughlai cuisine or North Indian food or Punjabi food. But then eat something very different from the South, or very different from Bengal or whatever. And even within the South, there are 4 distinct cuisines. There's a lot of difference between the Andhra tolerance for chilies, for example, and the kinds of spices we use. But anyway, and more coconuts in Kerala.
We're very lucky to be in Melbourne and have such an array of South Asian food. And I have to say, some of the best South Asian food I have had has been made by Kishwar Chowdhury. So thank you, Kishwar, for being such an incredible culinary
well, I haven't had that pleasure
leader.
yet, so before I can answer that question, I'll have to come back again.
Okay, yes, up to the back.
Dr. Tharoor, thank you. Samuel Bashfield. I'm a researcher here at the university. I was hoping to get your views on the balance of power here in the Indo-Pacific, and specifically whether you think we're entering a Cold War 2.0. Do you think that the future will be dominated by Sino-US competition, or is there a more multilateral balance of power you think is emerging?
I delivered an entire lecture on that topic yesterday at the Australian Institute of International Affairs, and I'm told it'll be on the web before too long, so I'll certainly send you a link through Lisa. But let me say that as far as the short version of the answer is concerned, yes, there is undoubtedly a bipolarity growing between the US and China, but it's not the bipolarity we knew of the Cold War. There's much more interpenetration between the two countries, between their economies, between their peoples, and so you just can't see it anything like Cold War 1.0. There is a Cold War 2.0, but it's qualitatively very different. I mean, imagine the biggest investor in China is the US. The government with the largest share of US Treasury bonds is China. The largest number of tourists to China are Americans. The largest number of students in America are Chinese. I mean, you've got all of these connections, and so it's not the Soviet Union versus the USA. But having said all of that, I do believe there's a very significant strategic competition. I do believe that China, under Xi Jinping, has thrown off any pretense of a peaceful rise. Deng Xiaoping's famous bide your time, they're no longer biding their time. They've been pushing themselves. Australia got a taste of it with your trade sanctions. We got this nasty episode on the borders where there've been a very friendly arrangement for 4.5 decades for both sides to patrol certain disputed points in turn. So they wouldn't point guns at each other, they'd go on different days kind of thing. That's been thrown to the winds by the Chinese. You've got this internal oppression in Hong Kong and with the Uyghurs. I mean, this is a different Chinese government from the government of, all the way right up to the, and including the first decade of the century. Between Tiananmen Square and the first decade, you had a softer, more benign China. And today you've got a tough, assertive China. And they clearly wish to be, at the very least, an alternative superpower, if not the preeminent power in the world. And the US doesn't like that idea. And I was pointing out earlier, I've forgotten, I don't think it was at this forum, but anyway, the Chinese Navy now has 3/4 of the ships. The Americans have about 4,000 ships and the battleships, and the Chinese have 3,100, but many of them are more cutting edge. The Air Force has actually more physical non-drone aircraft in China than the Americans do. PLA, of course, is always more numerous than America in terms of soldiers on the ground. You're looking at a very formidable military machine, but of course America's budget dwarfs that of China. America still has about 50% of global military spending. But then you've got that kind of power, but then economics is also power. And the Chinese economy is well on course to equal and one day overtake the Americans before the middle of the century. It seems to be remorselessly heading that way. Even during a relatively less good period of Chinese growth, they're still growing that much faster than America. So I think there is going to be, very clearly, a major competition, and the Indo-Pacific is the obvious theater for it. We are at the land end of the problem, and you folks are at the water end of the problem. And I think it'll be foolish of us to pretend that we can all be lovey-dovey and live in peace. We can, I think, construct areas of cooperation that would make a conflict, certainly a hot war, less likely. But war, by and large, always is irrational. A decision to go to war is very rarely triggered by a cost-benefit analysis of the long term, because then no war would ever have been fought. Every war causes more destruction, suffering, loss of life, and economic damage than not having a war would have. So we can't just be rational about it, we have to prepare. I mean, what's to prevent a Chinese leader from deciding that the hell of this, I'm going to take over Taiwan, I don't like what this fellow is saying there. And who all are going to react, how far they're going to go in their reaction, will they risk even a nuclear conflict to protect Taiwan, or will they say it's not worth it? I mean, Hong Kong had all sorts of guarantees on paper when it was given to China in 1991. They've all gone, they've all been shredded, and no one's lifted a finger to stand up for those solemn agreements of that period. So tomorrow, I don't know.
We've got time for one more question. I can see a
we
multitude
can take a couple more,
of hands up, but perhaps we can go with a lighter question to end on.
G'day. Thank you very much for your conversation
You hold
today,
it
by
up
the
a
way.
little higher, sorry.
Beg your pardon?
Hold the mic up a little higher.
Sorry, is that better?
Say your name.
So I'm Oscar, I'm a graduate student here at the University of Melbourne, and I just thought maybe on a lighter note, obviously the Indian cricket team's back out over here again, and given obviously India's most recent loss, and as Minister Tim Watts already mentioned, to New Zealand recently, how do you think India's going to be going up against Australia in a couple of weeks?
Not very well. I think, first of all, you've used your surrogates from across the other part of the Antipodes to come and sort of, take the stuffing out of us at home in India. So it's a very demoralized lot that are going to come. Then they came and played Australia A in Perth and got clobbered. I mean, humiliatingly so, and not much better in Melbourne. So that the next generation isn't actually feeling that they can do better than their seniors either. So I'm expecting the worst. I'm expecting a complete rout in Perth. In any case, India historically starts every series badly. I think the number of series we won where we lost the first test is longer than any other country's record. And there have been many series we've lost where we also lost the first. We started off by losing the first test. So the Perth test, I'm already writing off in my mind. I think we could do better in Adelaide. We might be with our backs against the wall in Melbourne at the MCG, and I think we could hold our own in Sydney. I don't have the highest expectations, but let me say that in 2020-21, a ragtag Indian team completely shattered by injuries and absences. I mean, by the time we won the final test, we were essentially playing a second 11. If they were able to win the series, nothing is impossible. But I do think the present Australian side is stronger than the one we beat then under Tim Payne. I think this one is I mean, I really, as a cricket tragic, I'm not at all looking forward to the bad news that's going to be coming over the next 6-7 weeks.
Well, thank you for your questions, and hopefully there was some time to meet with Dr. Tharoor as we close. Let me say how much I have enjoyed today's discussion with Dr. Tharoor. Both Tim Watts and I think at the outset really spoke so highly of Dr. Tharoor in our opening remarks, but you can tell from the quality of today's discussion that we did not exaggerate. Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor, for joining us. Good luck in Perth in 2 weeks' time with the test. And please do come back and join with us again at the Australia-India Institute. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lisa and Dr. Tharoor, for that fascinating conversation. I think I could speak to all of us that we could just sit here and listen to you talk the whole time. I got into a nice daze. I'd now like to invite our CEO of Maurice Blackburn, Jacob Varghese, to give the final closing remarks.
Thank you, Sarah. Can I start by saying, Dr. Tharoor, that I hope you're not going to New Zealand next, because referring to the New Zealand cricket team as surrogates of Australia may not be the most popular thing you could say there. Maurice Blackburn is a law firm dedicated to helping everyday Australians. As Dr. Tharoor talked about, the everyday Australians these days includes 1 million people of Indian origin. And so it's very important for us to reach out to the Indian community. But more than that, Maurice Blackburn is very committed to contributing to Australia and making Australia always a better and more mature country. And it's very obvious to us that understanding and building the bilateral relationship with India is a critical part of Australia's journey in the coming decades. We've come so far, we've got so much more to do. Dr. Tharoor gave a lot of reasons why that relationship is so important. So in that vein, we're very thankful to the Australia-India Institute and Lisa for inviting us to participate in this event today. Lisa's been talking to me for some months about, or some years possibly, about doing an event together. And I did say to Lisa, I'm not sure we're up for a visiting dignitary talking to a kind of university set. And she said, what if we could get Dr. Tharoor? And I said, oh, of course we'd do that. Because aside from anything, we know that Dr. Tharoor will help that journey of understanding and increasing literacy in Australia of India and the bilateral relationship. But also I'm a personal fanboy. I visited Trivandrum a few years ago. My family is from Kerala originally. Visited Trivandrum with my daughter recently and went into a bookstore where a bookstore in Trivandrum has an entire shelf dedicated to Dr. Tharoor, who is, in my view, one of the most interesting legislators in the world, maybe second only to my friend Tim Watts in the audience. So Dr. Tharoor, thank you. You didn't disappoint. You really got into a lot of interesting issues, and I think we're all better off for having listened to your erudite views on all the subjects that you covered. I will just finish by noting, though, the most curious answer I thought you gave was, given an opportunity to talk about Keralan food, you talked about the diversity of Indian food and how great it all is. I've never heard a Malayali be so modest before.
I'm very bad because I'm a Malayali vegetarian. The strengths of Kerala cuisine are fried fish and variations thereof that I cannot wax eloquent about. I don't eat them.
That's true, although one of the best vegetarian dishes meals I've ever had was in Trivandrum. Well, that's interesting to know. That's the cause of his modesty, because I'll say as a Malayali, that clearly the best contribution that Malayalis make to the world is one of the world's great cuisines. Thank you again. Thank you to Tim for opening. Thank you, Lisa, for inviting us to participate. And thank you, Dr. Tharoor, for making the way to Melbourne.
Thank you so much, all of you, for
Thank
being
you.
We now have a light